So at the last session, we talked mainly about primary school entry and even nursery school entry for younger children. And now we're coming to a really big decision that parents have to make, which is the secondary school entry for their child. And it is one of the most enormous decisions we make for our children, because our child will enter this school as a child, age 11, and they will leave that school, usually taller than us, usually aged 18. And those are their formative years. Those are the years in which they move from childhood to adulthood. Those are the years in which many of their ideals and values and experiences of life are first formed. And I haven't even mentioned academics yet. Obviously, those are the years in which they take examinations such as GCSEs and A-levels, which will in turn determine, higher education choices, university, and so on. And and so it's an enormous decision for us to make. The peer group that they spend time with, the way that they are treated by the staff and the teachers at the school, the enrichment that they have within the school, the relationship between you and the school, the way in which the school supports them to make healthy choices in terms of their lifestyle as well, are all so important. And so the idea of making this choice, or even in fairness for many parents up and down the UK, not having much of a choice, can be quite overwhelming. So I'll start with just talking about the basics of secondary application for state schools. And this includes the state grammar schools. Of course, these are state funded, and you need to apply for them by the 31st of March on your local DFE form, department, your local authority form. And then you will get your results. You'll be told which school your child has received a place at on the 1st of March, or the next Monday after the 1st of March, if the 1st of March is a Saturday or Sunday. For grammar schools, the deadline hasn't been set this year, but the deadline to apply to sit the examination is usually early July. The examination is usually the first Saturday of term in September for the Warwickshire and Birmingham grammars, and usually a little later than that in September for the Walsall and Wolverhampton grammars. And then, of course, you've got the independent schools with a slightly different admissions timetable for each one, really. But typically, you've got up until September to make an application to sit the examination for these schools. And typically you would get your results in December, although I know this year with Kes, due to lockdown and interviewing issues and so on, that was January. So there's quite a lot to think about, because ultimately you've got a number of choices for secondary school. You've got selective independent schools, highly selective schools such as KES and KHS for girls in Edgbaston. You've got relatively non-selective independent schools where there still may be some form of entry assessment, but the level on entry is a bit wider, such as Priory or St George's or Lichfield Cathedral School and Highclere. And these still remain excellent schools, but without such stringent entry requirements. And then you've got schools like EHS and Solihull, sort of in the middle of this, really, with still some level of academic selection and increasingly more so. Then you've got the state grammar schools, which you don't pay any fees for. They're fully state funded. And I guess what I should do is perhaps share my screen so you've got something visual to look at. And I've got to be honest, I'm sharing from my website because that's where it's quite visually represented. So if you wanted to see this again, it is available on the web. So if we have a look at grammar schools in Birmingham, there are 8. And so you've got from these 8 schools, schools which are for boys only, schools which are for girls only, and you've got King Edward's Five Ways, which is co-educational for boys and girls. Just outside of Birmingham, we'll get to some other grammar schools as well. So the examination for all of the grammar schools in this entire region is set by CEM, Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring at the University of Durham. You cannot actually get past papers as such. But what we do know, of course, is that for many years now, I mean, I don't know, 10 years, the examination now allocates 50% of the points available for verbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning is thinking using words. It's probably another word for literacy, and it will include comprehension, vocabulary knowledge, general reading and word application. And then 50% of these points are allocated for mathematics, which they like to call numerical reasoning, and non-verbal reasoning. Non-verbal reasoning is thinking, not using words. So you're probably familiar and you've seen some of these tests where there are things such as shapes and arrows and so on, just testing your thinking skills that are non-verbal without using words. So obviously the examination format does and can change slightly from year to year. It's always had comprehension and it certainly includes vocabulary, maths, NVR, but the general skills may change from year to year. So I would, caution against simply preparing a child for an exam. I mean, the really good thing about just preparing a child's intelligence and knowledge overall is that you win either way, because whatever the outcome, that child gets to keep all of that knowledge and all of their skills and all of that confidence, because you're building the overall child rather than narrowly preparing for a specific exam, which is subject to change. So in Birmingham, we've got, I mean, I'm not in Birmingham, but in Birmingham, you've got 6 preferences for schools, and that's pretty generous on the secondary school application form, one of the best in terms of local authorities nationally. And of course, Birmingham is the largest local authority in Europe. So you do have a lot of schools to choose from, and you may be near the borders of other local authorities too, and you may choose a school over the border. So you do have 6 preferences. There's often a lot of confusion when it comes to preferences. This idea that, can schools see where I put them? Shall I put this one first, for example, because they might know and I won't get the place? It really doesn't work like that at all. I do know of a case, it's a real life case, where years ago, a father's daughter was very able, highly academic, and wanted to go to King Edward's Camp Hill Girls. But the father was a little bit nervous. He went along, this is true, he went along to the parents' evening or open day at Moseley Secondary School, sort of just between Sparkhill and Moseley. And at that parents' evening, they said, if you want your child to come to Moseley School, you must put it first choice. That's according to the father anyway, that's what he told me. Right. And he did. He put it first choice. And then, because he was worried, or what if my daughter doesn't get into Camp Hill, then I would have a school for her. And as second choice, he put Camp Hill. Of course, the daughter did get the score for Camp Hill. She would have been able to go. But of course, he got his first choice because, in terms of admissions every year, Moseley is not oversubscribed. And it tends to admit all of those who have listed it on their form. So, of course, she got a place at Moseley. And he could not appeal for Camp Hill, because you can only appeal for a school which is higher on your preference form than the one which you got. He got his first choice. There was therefore no means for appeal. And so that's a real life scenario, but I've heard of how this happening. So although I know I'm speaking to quite a lot of parents who know about this, if you ever get the chance to talk to others, it's just a really important point to clarify, which is you put your schools in order of preference. So if Camp Hill Girls is your first preference, but you're still not sure if your daughter will get in, put it first. If she does not get in, doesn't get the score, they will look at your second choice. And if you fulfill the criteria for your second choice, distance, for example, you will get your second choice, and so on and so forth down the list. Do not be afraid to use those choices at the top, because if your child doesn't get into that preferred school, they will be treated absolutely equally for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth school on the list. So the application form should be carefully thought about. And for those parents whose children are currently in year 5, you've got until October to think about this, but it's a good time to be thinking about it now. A tricky time as well, because of course there haven't really been any school open days where you can actually go into the school due to the pandemic. It's not 100% clear whether there will be in summer, but due to this, certainly all of the grammars that I've seen have got online tours available on their website, and many will have online conferences even if they can't bring you into the school. So there's a lot of decision making to be done, a lot of research to be done. Buy yourself a notebook or something, and start thinking about what's best for the child in terms of all of those options that we have got. So for Solihull parents, you've got 5 preference choices. Smaller local authority. Worcestershire are the worst off, really. I'm out to close my blinds, being blinded by the winter sun here. Worcestershire are only offering 3 choices. It's a pretty tricky situation for those in Worcestershire, because they've got a sort of first, middle, and high school system, as some local authorities do, whereby many children attend middle school until the end of year 8 and then move on to high school in year 9. And so that's one of the reasons why they only have 3 choices available. So past entry scores are interesting. When you're thinking about grammar schools, you're obviously sometimes choosing between grammar, or you're choosing between grammar and independent, or indeed you're choosing between grammar and your local secondary state school. And I suppose this comes down to, I'll stop this just for now, the choices that we're having to make. And that's why one of the first things that I think as parents we need to do is stop and think what we really, really want from a secondary school for our child. Bear with me while I close those blinds. So it's a tricky one. Is it just prestige, the name of the school? My son got into this school. Is it the scores that they get, that you see on the DFE tables? Is it other things? Again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, if you'd missed it, this is the place where your child will go from childhood to adulthood, where they will spend their formative years of their youth, where, very much, will make friends who guide them either on the path that you want them to be on or on the path that you don't, and will, through their experiences with the school, their sense of belonging, and the teachers, develop quite significantly. So then we need to sit back and say, yes, academics are very important, and looking at the GCSE percentage scores and number of 8s and 9s and all of that is important. But perhaps more importantly is how my child is going to settle in, fit in, be comfortable and happy within that school. What are the ethos and the values of the school really? What do they really like? How can I research this? How can I find out from parents? What level of support is available within the school? What sort of child do you have? It's quite fascinating, really. I've got 5 children, and none of them are like each other at all. They all have their own needs, their own personality, their own way of approaching their academic studies. Some who very much like to sit at a desk and work and get on with their studies and will do so relatively unsupervised. Some who need, a watchful eye upon them day and night to get them to do anything. And that matters, because there may be some schools that offer more of a university style experience where the children are allowed to pretty much get on with their own studies and expected to do so, and some where there is a much higher level of discipline and supervision in place. So how can you find out more about that? Perhaps you have a child who has some level of special educational need, in which case you're going to really carefully think about how they will feel within a particular school environment and what is going to work well for them, and what helps them to achieve. Simply sending a child to a high achieving school does not force them to achieve. Every one of these high achieving schools that we know of and can name will have some children who leave with exceptionally poor results or with exceptionally poor outcomes or even poor mental health outcomes for many reasons. Then there are schools. I know of one girl who went to Heartlands High. And if you don't know Heartlands High, it is probably the most inner city school that we've got in Birmingham, in Neachels. And certainly not famous for an exceptionally academic reputation, but she came out with um, 11 GCSEs, all at grade 9. All at grade 9, yes? I'm not saying you must send your child to Heartlands High, I'm just giving that comparison. Where will your child thrive? Where will your child be happy? Where will your child feel comfortable and looked after? On the other hand, something I've also seen that's a little bit worrying is limiting aspirations. I've heard people say things such as, no, we don't send our children to Camp Hill. That's not for the likes of us. That's not for us. Or parents who say, well, my child's received a full assisted place at a school such as Keza. I'm not sure about sending him. I don't know if he'll fit in. We're not rich. We're not wealthy. And I would really caution against that as well. That's limiting aspirations. I actually see that a lot when it comes to preparing for these selective school exams. Even with parents who are paying for tuition, there are sometimes little sentences coming out that limit aspirations. I think what we want for our child is just the absolute stars. And we should never be afraid or worried about doing that. I suppose I'll just digress and share with you a little poem here, if you don't mind. This is a poem that, bear with me because you'll get a little bit more of the webpage than the poem, but I'm going to share the poem. This is a poem that I make my pupils memorize before they start with me. And it means so much. It means so much. And every year, and although I've said this for many years, every year it means more to me. And when we're talking about, is our child suitable for a selective school, particularly if you go back to a young age with your child, is my child able to do this? Is my child capable? Obviously, if we discount children with quite significant special needs, I really am very, very much a fan of nurture, not nature. If anybody's read any books by Matthew Said, he's written some brilliant children's books recently. But if you read some of his earlier, slightly more academic books, such as Bounce by Matthew Said, by the way, he was an Olympic table tennis champion. That's why the book's called Bounce, perhaps. He writes about how it's not really nature. It's not really, I mean, none of my children were born able to read. I'm pretty sure your children weren't born able to. Somebody taught them to read. Somebody taught them to do maths. And within that book, he looked in detail at violinists in Europe, so top violinists across Western Europe. And he divided the violinists, or the scientists in the study divided the violinists into 3 categories. So we had the violinists who were top solo violinists in top orchestras. Then we had the violinists who were playing the violin in the orchestra. Then we had the violinists who had become sort of general sort of school violin music teachers, so on, who weren't actually in the orchestras or playing solo. And then the study asked the violinists to go back to when they first started learning, when they were a child, usually, and try to calculate how many hours they had spent practicing the violin. And the results were stark. The table was clear. There were virtually no anomalies. The very top soloist violinists had simply spent the most hours practicing the violin. The ones in the middle had spent the middle amount of hours practicing the violin. The ones at the end had spent the least amount of hours practicing the violin. That's just how it works. There is no doubt that even if I look at my own 5 children, some of them had to work far harder to get where they are academically. And some of them, perhaps you could say, naturally grasping things more easily than the others, or developing faster than the others, um, put in less work to get where they were academically. But at the end of the day, if a child is prepared to put in the work, they will. They will. Have no issue getting there in the end. If they're putting in the time, they're putting in the effort, they're putting in the work. That's my opinion. Obviously, if we discount children with quite significant educational needs. Okay, here's the poem. Sometimes we have little voices inside us that tell us we can't do things. And I'm going to share something a little personal, perhaps. I had a voice inside me. Due to a few medical issues, I said to myself, for years, I said, I can't lose weight. I mean, I wasn't enormous, to be fair. I was a bit overweight. I said, I can't lose weight. Most people with my medical issues are enormous, so I can't lose weight. Here I am, I'm okay. I can't lose anything. I carried on doing this for years. And then in early December, in the space of 10 days, I lost 1.5 stone. You might be really listening now to find out which diet I was on. It was I got COVID, and I'm not sure I would really recommend it, but it was quite fascinating. And by the way, I've kept the 1.5 stone off since, which is quite good. So here I am, sort of recovering from COVID. 2 weeks later, I can stand up. I can stand on the scales. I can find my size 10 trousers from the back of the cupboard. And I'm thinking, oh, that voice in my head that told me I cannot do this, that voice was wrong, because actually I could do it. But why I'm telling you this example is because every day I hear this. Not every day, but every week. I couldn't do the reading this week. I had too much to do from one of my pupils. I never take that excuse. I always ask them how many hours they're on a week, which, if I remember correctly, is about 184, and I'm pretty sure that gives you enough hours to do your reading. But yes, my child couldn't do the homework this week. They had this on, they had that on. I mean, obviously, barring terrible happenings such as illness and bereavement, in most cases, they are excuses. Sorry, they're little sentences in somebody's mind that says, I can't do this. My child can't do this, and so on. Bear with me. You see, I am connected to Teams via my child's account, which means that I am simultaneously supervising at the same time, and occasionally we get a few dung when the teacher's saying something. So if you hear any noise, apologies for that. Going back to the little sentences in our head, all of us will sometimes have the sentences, particularly when we're going through the 11 plus preparation. My child can't do this. My child won't do their work. I'm sure other children sit down and do their work nicely. I'm afraid to tell you that 90% probably don't. You know, we can't do this. As a family, I can't manage this. We can't manage that. It's those little voices that we really need to push out. And that's why I make all of these children memorize this poem before year 4 by Christopher Logue. And by the way, if you look at a lot of his poems, they're very short and very deep. Come to the edge, we might fall. Come to the edge, it's too high. Come to the edge. And they came, and we pushed, and they flew. And again, I'm not saying that you need to choose a selective school for your child. One thing I really, really respect is parents who say, you know what, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do the preparation for that. I want to put my child through that. I'm going to choose a non-selective school. I have every 100% respect for parents to make that decision. What is unfortunately a bit tragic, what makes me sad, is when parents go halfway. We'll send you to tuition, we'll make you do all of this work, but we won't quite go far enough to actually get you into the selective school. I'm afraid that's a bit cruel. If you were going to do something in life, we may as well just do it properly and put all of our efforts into it, all the effort that we possibly can. And I suppose then, even so, there may be a few very minor, small occasions where the child doesn't make it, despite 100% effort, and that would be the case that, you know, the sorting hat has chosen. I mean, when I sent all of my children into the 11 plus exam, I did so with absolute relaxation. Sorting hat will choose now. I've done what I can do. With the 11 plus, it pretty much is the very last examination that you can help your child with. If you are supervising and helping the child through their GCSEs and A levels, then there's a potential issue and problem now. You're going to continue helping them through every year of university. So in secondary, they will stand on their own feet and hopefully have the support of their secondary school to do so. If they're online, you just have to keep going into the room and checking that they don't have Fortnite open on another tab, but that's another story. Ultimately, it is the very final examination that we can help our child with. I know I'm sort of beating around the bush a little bit here with lots of different ideas and topics. So we have choices. We have choices with our children's secondary school education as to whether in this area, so Walsall, Warwickshire and Birmingham, it will be selective or not, or a local school, which works brilliantly for many children. And we're also going to have choices when it comes to um, whether we choose to pay for independent school provision or not, a payment that is generally beyond the reach of the vast majority of people. As we probably know, independent schools do offer assisted places and scholarships to children who perform very well. Scholarships are academic, usually also music scholarships, and some schools offer sports scholarship too, not very many. So just going down, I introduced the Birmingham grammar schools, and here's a list of them. Bishop Vesey's grammar for boys and Sutton Coldfield grammar for girls remain what we might call super selective grammar schools. They don't have a catchment area. You could apply to them from anywhere, you could travel to them from anywhere. And they therefore will simply take boys and girls on their score. So we don't know exactly what the score is going to be until we get to the 1st of March and we find out what the score was of the last boy or girl to get into that school that year. When children take the 11 plus examination, scores are standardized. And a lot of people are unsure. They say to me, what is this score out of? Well, it's not out of anything. It's basically that on any given year, within that cohort of children taking the exam, not national cohort, just the children taking the exam, the average child will get 200, because 100 for the English and verbal reasoning, 100 for the maths and non-verbal reasoning. Average child will get 200. And the points above or below 200 are deviations from that level. So therefore, a child on 220 is quite a high deviation from that level. That's a pretty high score. When you get children on 240, 250, 260, they will be amongst just the top few percent of children who took the examination. And then the scores you don't hear of, but certainly exist, are the ones below 200. And that will be a deviation below that 200. So it's interesting. 223 one year might be different in terms of actual academic ability to 223 the other year. It all depends on the cohort. So although I have no doubt that the current year 5 cohort are overall a little lower in ability due to the disruption caused by the pandemic, it's not going to affect the way the scores work because the average child will still get 200 and the rest will be a deviation from that. It's interesting to have a little look at Bishop Vesey's grammar. So if we go all the way back to 2011, the last boy to get into that school got 215. And then that has changed over the years until in 2019, the last child to get into that school got 228. Now, I should say that the scores in 2020, that is the current year 6 cohort, no, the scores in 2020, that is the current year 7 cohort who are currently in the schools, current year 7, and this is the score we're talking about here, they were, and you've probably noticed this, they were a bit odd. I can't give you a mathematical reason for that. All I can say is, without a doubt, that particular cohort, the current year 7, the scores were a bit odd. And that really is seen by the way in which scores generally go up and up and up, and then dropped in 2020. Despite the fact that that cohort was obviously not affected in any way by the pandemic. They were in March of year 6 and had done their exam when the pandemic hit the UK. So we can see that that score is generally going up. It's becoming more competitive. We also know that, of course, scores can be changed when schools expand and add additional year groups, so additional numbers, and that affects the scores because then more children are being admitted. Similarly with Sutton Coldfield Grammar, we can see how the scores change. However, there's been a real big change to the admissions policies of the King Edward VI grammar schools, which of course form the majority of the grammar schools around Birmingham. They have created a catchment. If you have a look at the websites here, schools of King Edward VI.co.uk/admissions policy, you can have a look at this and it gives you much more information here. You can see that the King Edward VI Grammar School catchment areas have now been set. And they, of course, came into play with the current year 7, and so we're now on our next year of doing that. And what they did is they said that children who scored the qualifying score within these catchment areas will get a place at the school, ideally. And if there are more children, for example, if you have a look at this, this is the Camp Hill Boys catchment. If there are more children who got the qualifying score than places, we will admit according to distance within the catchment area. So if you're up here, yes, on the edge of Bordsley Green on a score of 270, that person here right next to Camp Hill School in Brandwood on 223 has priority over you. So slightly different selection criteria going on here. So we've got these catchments. This is showing the boys' catchments. Camp Hill Boys being here, making up what appears to be a small area, but is actually the most populous area in terms of population density. There are more children in that area than there are in this area, which is a much lower density population. And so Kings Heath, Sparkbrook, Yaycox Green, Small Heath, Bordsley, and so on. And then we've got the Five-Way School taking up all of these areas here: Harborne, Bartley Green, Longbridge, Bourneville. And then we've got the yellow area, which is for Handsworth Grammar School for Boys, which only relatively recently joined the King Edward VI Consortium. And that, of course, takes us around Handsworth and Edgbaston and up to Kingstanding. And then this area seems to be big, but it isn't that big in terms of population, because a whole load of it happens to be Sutton Park, where nobody lives. And also many people in this area choose to go to the Sutton Coldfield Grammars, which are not King Edward VI Grammars. So this area here, of course, is for King Edward's Aston School. Going down to the girls, slightly different because there are fewer girls' grammars. It might seem unfair, but there are actually more spaces for girls in Handsworth Girls and Camp Hill Girls than there are in Handsworth Boys and Camp Hill Boys. Almost evens out. And then you've got the Five-Way schools. So Camp Hill Girls, same catchment. Five-Way, same catchment. But all of this area is Handsworth School for Girls, which does happen to be probably the biggest grammar in any case to get into. So having these catchments has changed things quite a lot for the King Edward VI schools. And so we're no longer talking about last score in, we're talking about distance as well as last score in. Last year, the current year 7, the score to get in was set at 222. So that's a really big change. I mean, whereas previously to get into Camp Hill Boys, you needed a minimum of 249. That's now 222 to get in, as long as you are in catchment area. Catchment boys were offered up to 4,477, 4,700, and so I don't teach maths, 75 meters. But what happened is after offer day, they did offer to all boys in catchment, and they did even go outside and offer to some boys outside of catchment on high scores. Similarly, with five ways, not all of catchment were offered on offer day. They offered up to about 4.5 kilometres. And with Camp Hill girls, all of the catchment girls were offered. It's a bigger school, by the way, than Camp Hill boys. And they also offered out of catchment. Once you're out of catchment, distance doesn't matter. They'll go with score. And so it was for girls above 245 there. With Handsworth Grammar School for girls, all catchment girls offered, and those out of catchment above 214. Relatively straightforward there. And similarly with Aston, all out of catchment above 213, with Handsworth Grammar, all out of catchment above 213. So you could be living in Solihull, for example, and even if we don't think about the travel, you could still get into King Edward's Aston above 213 for that particular cohort. I'm just going to skip independent and move to the grammar schools and neighbouring authorities and come back to independent later. But Warwickshire is interesting. They have a priority area. You can click on this and see the priority area on the Warwickshire website, which is around 17 miles radius from the Stratford-upon-Avon clock tower, which includes most of Solihull, and it skirts part of Hall Green and Kings Norton, the side on the other side of Highfield Road and bits of Kings Norton as well. For next year's entry, however, the Stratford, the Warwickshire schools are consulting on a different sort of admission circle, which would be around 11 miles and would cut out Solihull. And it's interesting because they'll still keep a proportion of places, a percentage of places available for those outside priority circle. And indeed, even now, you can get in outside the priority circle, but you won't get in on offer day on the 1st of March. You'll be popped on the waiting list and then hopefully move in that way via your score. And yeah, 13 miles, not 11. Then we move on to Walsall. And Queen Mary's Grammar School for boys and High School for girls remain, just like the Sutton Coldfield schools, super selectives. There's no catchment or location link whatsoever. And the score to get in was getting higher and higher until the bizarre year that we had last year. And they have a slightly different system. Their exam is a little different. It's the same CEM exam with the same sort of formatting, but a third of the marks will be for the verbal reasoning literacy. A third of the marks will be for the mathematics. A third of the marks will be for non-verbal reasoning. So I suppose this exam slightly favours those who are a little bit more non-verbal mathematical, slightly disfavours those with the literacy strength in that part, although a third is still important. It's a slightly different way, and that's why we get scores that are in the 300s to get in, because your average child taking the Queen Mary's exam would get 300, and the rest is a deviation from that. The historical records are really fascinating, and we get on to the pupil premium last scores, which used to be as they're shown here, but for those who are pupil premium pupils, which because of the pandemic, I understand, is an increasing and larger percentage of children within the area, they would receive a place at the school at these grammar schools on a score of 205. The aim being, of course, to have an absolute minimum of a quarter of the school, 25% of the school, for the King Edward's Grammars to be pupil premium children eligible for free school meals. Therefore from backgrounds which one would assume are relatively deprived. And they will, of course, go higher than that in order to add all those pupil premium children in. So even if they went to 80% pupil premium within their catchment area, they will go to that in order to make sure that those pupil premium children above 205, that score could change slightly this year, I don't know, will get that place. Moving on to independent schools, there are several in and around Birmingham. There's the famous Cares in Edgbaston, KHS in Edgbaston. There's also Solihull, interesting option, which, like many of the independent schools around Birmingham, due to the changes in admissions, catchment areas, and so on, are starting to become a bit more selective and really more forward thinking in terms of what they offer. There's Bromsgrove, there's Warwick, there's King's Worcester, there's King's High and Warwick. There's other schools such as Highclere, Lichfield Cathedral, Priory, and St George's, and some of them do offer quite generous scholarships as well, or assisted places. So the thing about independent schools is they are fee paying. You do need to go to their website because they all have different dates for admissions. They have different dates to register. They have different types of selection and exams. And some, of course, will have interviews as well for some of the pupils. I can see it's 11:47 and you've been subjected to a long monologue on myself. I want to, before I take questions, talk about something really important, and that is non-selective schools and the options that are available there for parents. And I guess you could look at Ofsted. I don't myself. There's some level of discreditation then, not least that many schools last were Ofsteded before my youngest, who's now 11, was even born, and therefore the Ofsted is extremely out of date. But I prefer to sort of focus on clear quantitative information, and that would of course include the school's website and all of the information on there, drilling down to extracurricular offers, which we haven't talked very much about but remain vital in terms of the child's life and development. I know a lot of people may just say, what are the results? What GCSEs are you going to get? What course are you going to do? What university are you going to go into? But there are other important courses. I mean, the ability to speak, to talk, to debate, to play games like chess, which build logic, to develop lifelong healthy habits, such as taking part in sports as well. Schools which emphasize things such as emotional health and mindfulness, schools which emphasize inclusion and diversity. All of these vary from school to school in terms of what they provide for your child. Then, of course, you've got religious schools, you've got non-religious schools, you've got some schools who are happy to accept and work with children's own religion, culture, and values, and others where the ethos is not that way at all. Your child, for example, may be used to praying 5 times a day, as many Muslim children are, and go to a school where that is actually not allowed. Some schools that's not allowed. So you need to go and double check all of those things and what is available for your child and what is acceptable within that school, and how your child is going to navigate that school and the way in which they are treated and the way in which the pupils of that school will treat and behave with and get to know your child as well. And that ethos tends to trickle down actually from the leadership of the school. So if we go to the DFE website, if we just type into Google DFE performance tables, we can find and compare schools in England. And what I like to do is click this one to search by local authority. And I'll type in Birmingham, which is enormous, but never mind. I know that most of the parents here there, you could type in Solihull, Warwickshire, Walsall, and so on. So I've searched for Birmingham now, and we've got primary performance. So I'm going to click on secondary performance, and I've got the schools here listed. Now I can organize my table via the columns at the top. So if I'm really interested, for example, in the Progress 8 score, this score shows the progress that children make from the Year 6 SATs, the end of Key Stage 2 in primary school, up to their GCSEs. So what is the level of progress that they make? And so if children in, for example, a relatively deprived area are coming in with very poor scores at the age of 11, then get reasonable GCSEs, that would come as well above average progress. Or I could say I just want the actual score, the Attainment 8 score, the score that they get at the end. I'll just sort the table here by Attainment 8 score. So we've got Campiel at the top, which it has been for many years, remembering, of course, that any changes to the cohort and the selection in Camp Hill will not show for many years to come. It's just the current Year 7 cohort that have come in under the new selection criteria. With their Attainment 8 score, this is looking at your top 8 GCSEs, scores for those, and seeing what the sort of average is, average out your top 8 scores. It's not even going to look at your 9th and 10th and so on, GCSE, interestingly enough. Followed, of course, by Camp Hill for Girls, followed by a very small independent school with 10 pupils. Albohan advertises itself as a grammar school. It's not necessarily a grammar school with an 11+ examination, as far as I'm aware. Certainly has done well with its 10 pupils. Of course, each one of those pupils would have been a very high sort of percentage mathematically. Followed by Five Ways, followed by, well, we're getting there, Bishop Vesey's, Sutton Girls, Handsworth School. That's the girls one. And then Aston, Handsworth for boys, and we get to Eden School in Birmingham, which is, again, was a relatively small cohort, but has certainly expanded as a school since. And Hartland's Academy, which, as I said before, does not have a record for academic learning, but is fascinating because it shows you just what I was telling you before, that there's no need to ever limit the ambitions of a child, and they will have, if I go in, extremely high numbers, for example, of free school meals. I'm just going to go in to Heartland's Academy, and I'm going to show you what you can do in terms of finding out even more about the school. Progress 8 score here, EBAC, is where a child gets their English and their maths and humanities, such as history, geography, and a language, sciences. They get their scores above 6 for those EBACs. We can drill down. We can look at the results even by pupil characteristics in more detail. For example, we could open up disadvantaged pupils, that is, pupils on pupil premium, and we can see their particular progress score and grades and so on. We can go back and look at the pupil population of the school by clicking absence and pupil population. We can see their overall absence, their persistent absence, their total number of schools on the roll, pupils on the roll divided by boys and girls here. With this many pupils who have an actual, this is what used to be called statemented an education, health and care plan, quite significant special needs, pupils who are on the SEN support register, pupils whose first language is not English. Don't get me started on that. I remember my boys went to a nursery, which was a lovely nursery, and the Ofsted report at that time, when they were both there, they're 20 and 21 now, the Ofsted report at that time said, I remember reading it, all of the pupils at this nursery have English as an additional language, which was new to me because tragically my boys don't really speak any other languages. So don't get me started on that, but that's the score there. And then we have got, wow, for Heartland's Academy, pupils eligible for free school meals at any time during the past 6 years. That's a pupil premium pupil, 71.7%, quite incredibly high. And yet still, these pupils have shown that when somebody believes in them, they will definitely make it in the end. Just in terms of pupil premium, I perhaps being a little unfair because things have changed a lot recently in Bishop Vesey's with more pupil premium pupils in the lower years. But if we have a look here, if we drill in to Bishop Vesey, a grammar school sitting in what is, in fairness, a pretty salubrious area, and I look at pupil population, I can see that at Bishop Vesey's 9%. See the difference. At any time during the past 6 years, we're eligible for pupil premiums. So quite a good website, this DFE website. And going down, of course, you can do all of this research. I know in your own time, you can drill down and see where these schools stand on your list. Now, it's interesting that when it comes to independent schools, many of them do IGCSEs, and they don't count on the DFE list, which is quite frustrating. So this may not be a fair reflection. You'll probably find KES and KHS near the bottom of the list, bizarrely, because despite being exceptionally academic, they do IGCSEs, many reasons. They'll tell you more about that when you ask them. And therefore, they're not necessarily shown clearly on the list. I have mentioned Nishcam before, and I will, in fairness, mention Nishcam before because I've worked with them, and I absolutely love the ethos of the school, the inclusivity of it. It is a Sikh school, but certainly as a Muslim, I felt there was literally a prayer room for me to go and pray in with prayer mats provided. I felt very included, and I know that they will accept pupils from other faith backgrounds as part of their faith criteria. You just have to actually practice a faith, be it Judaism, Catholicism, whatever. And as you can see, despite being an extremely new school, and it takes time for schools to build up, they're still doing pretty well. And then you've got, it's interesting actually that you've got so many religious ethos schools near the top with Al Hijra, with Bishop Walsh, and further up, of course, we saw St. Paul's, which is a Catholic school. That's quite interesting. Just in terms of ethos, I can't comment on that. And then we start to see schools listed in area. So we go to the most expensive area to buy a house in, which is something called Four Oaks in Birmingham, and we get one of the top schools. Similarly, this one in Harborne, this one in Sutton Coldfield, and we move on to Moseley and so on. So unfortunately, then we start to have schools divided by what are effectively house prices. And that takes you back to really important decisions that parents and families make that I still think we need a lot more advice really coming down to the younger generation when they start to choose schools and choose where they're going to buy houses and maybe choose smaller ones and so on according to the area that they're in. And that applies to primary schools